On Tuesday, September 10th, 1968, heat rose off the asphalt on Crenshaw Boulevard as if the street were breathing. And that September, it took only one mistimed gesture, one misread look for the tension coming out of newly redrawn school boundaries to stop being rumor and become a real fight. Walter Dimas opened the door at 7:26, as he had done for years, but already knowing that week the neighborhood would not come in only to get a haircut. It would come in to measure territory, test limits, look for a point of balance, and find out whether there was still a place where unknown men could sit side by side without tearing themselves apart inside. The front window trembled slightly with traffic and with a heavy RTD bus that passed by, stopping and pulling away at the stops, letting out diesel and lifting a fine dust that eventually settled on the glass. Inside, the air was a familiar, persistent mix. Menthol aftershave, talc, old coffee at the bottom of the thermos, disinfectant for the combs, and a sweet note of hair oil. The radio, low, talked about enrollments, buses, and decisions signed far from there that would nonetheless come knocking on ordinary people's doors. Walt listened without lingering, because he understood the next hours would decide whether that place would remain just a barbershop or become another friction point on the map. Walt was 54, still solid from decades spent on his feet, with a way of setting things in order that seemed quiet but carried urgency. The urgency of that September was not a lack of customers. It was the opposite. It was the kind of customers who were beginning to arrive. Since the end of August, after enrollment lists changed and the boundaries of some schools were redrawn, the sidewalk began to receive faces that had not been there before. Boys in light shirts with notebooks hugged to their chests, mothers with hair clips and grocery bags, fathers who worked early and carried fatigue like a tool, many still with construction dust or grease on their hands, crossing blocks that had not been part of their route. The hours bunched up in the late afternoon, when the school bell released the street all at once and the bus stops filled. People waiting under the sun and under store awnings. The mix was not newspaper talk. It was shoulder to shoulder in the grocery line, a sideways look at the stop, the concrete feeling that a paper map had pushed people into one another's lives without asking permission. That morning, without an announcement in the window and without a loud message, Walt placed a difference on the wood behind the counter. A new notebook with a black cover, and beside it a small time stamp with a clock face, the kind used to mark the time on a punch card. He made no ceremony of it, did not explain beforehand, did not ask approval. Even so, it was a change that could start a fight. Until the end of summer, the barbershop worked like so many others in South Los Angeles. Whoever arrived sat down, waited their turn, and when called, answered the greeting the place already knew. It was a language of its own, made of nicknames, shoulder pats, jokes about football, and about the price of gasoline, constant that year at counters and in lines. Walt had learned early that a barber chair was a place for conversation and, sometimes, for dispute. In 1968, dispute was in the air, and the air came in through the door with everyone else. At 7:42, Virgil Raines came in, a bread distribution truck driver, white shirt with flour stains at the cuffs, a mustache Walt had trimmed for years, and a loud way of talking that filled the room even when there were only two people. Virgil remarked that it was a hot morning, fanning himself with a crumpled Los Angeles Times, the paper already softened from being folded so many times. Walt answered with a nod and a short gesture, pointing to the waiting chair. Instead of asking who had arrived first and letting out the usual line, he opened the black notebook and, with a blue pen, wrote 7:42, Raines V. Then he stamped and placed a brown paper card with the same time on top of the counter, as if it were an old part of the place. Virgil frowned and asked since when that was a thing. Walt spoke low, steady, measuring his volume like someone not waking something that sleeps on the floor, saying it was as of that day and that it helped keep order. Virgil let out a short laugh. more surprise than amusement, but did not argue. He sat. The wall clock, with its insistent tick-tock, seemed to mark not only time, but the decision. At 8:05, a man Walt did not know came in. Younger, in his 30s, dark-skinned, a blue work shirt with Eddie embroidered on the chest, the fabric worn at the elbows like someone who spent the day bent over a bench. He carried a cap in his hand and looked at the mirrors as if searching for an exit, attentive to how the others occupied the space. Walt did not use the old greeting, heavy with familiarity and ownership of the place. He pointed to the counter and to the notebook, asking for name and time without harshness, without challenge. The man hesitated, as if calculating the risk of each word, then identified himself as Eddie Jackson and said he worked down on Vernon at the shop. Walt wrote 8:05 Jackson E. and handed him the card. The gesture was the same he had made with Virgil, with no difference of finger, of look, of time. On that kind of morning, equality was not a speech. It was something done with small repetitions, one after another, until it became a rule. The room, little by little, filled up and filled in a different way. Before, the barbershop received mostly men from the immediate neighborhood, people who knew one another by last name or nickname, similar routes, stories that had crossed for years. Now there also came fathers of children enrolled in schools off the old path, men who crossed the city because of a new boundary and used the trip there and back to fit in a cut, squeezing the service between shifts and buses. The name Dorsey high appeared in conversations alongside manual arts and fauché, and the word bus came in like a new object no one had asked for, with mention of lines, schedules, and stops where it was better not to be alone. Walt did not comment on the news. When the radio mentioned demonstrations and the National Guard in other cities, he turned the knob to a recorded baseball game. It was not escape, it was method. Certain words, said at the wrong moment, turned chairs into trenches, and he was not willing to let the barbershop become that. At noon, when the light in the window turned too white and the awning's shadow shrank, a mother came in holding a boy by the hand. The barbershop was not, by tradition, a place for a mother to enter, but September 1968 was changing traditions without asking permission. The boy was about 10, hair high and tightly curled, a uniform with an emblem sewn on the pocket, fabric already creased from use. He held a cardboard folder and looked at the barber chair as if it were a forbidden toy. The woman explained politely, in a contained voice, that she needed a quick cut because he got home late, the school was new and the bus was early, and the waiting time at the stop in the morning seemed longer than the clock said. Walt looked at the clock, looked at the notebook. The barbershop was full, and there were eyes narrowing at the simple fact that a woman was there, as if her presence changed the weight of the place. Walt did not raise his voice. He slid the notebook forward as if sliding a post office form, an ordinary thing, and said she could put the name down. There was a list. She wrote Marcus Lee, 1207, in the careful handwriting of someone who makes grocery lists and notes for a teacher. Walt stamped and handed the card to the boy. Marcus held the paper as if it were a ticket, as if that piece of paper guaranteed he would not be pushed out. Virgil grumbled without thinking, the rough grumble of someone who feels he owns a place, saying it was turning into a daycare. Walt picked up the broom, swept a handful of hair off the floor, and only then answered, looking at the line of the tile, not at Virgil's face, saying it was turning into a barbershop and a list was a list. The simple sentence carried a decision that needed no explanation. The place would not be ruled by the volume of the old-timers or by the insecurity of the newcomers. It would be ruled by ink and time, and that, in that moment, was a way to keep the ground firm. That week, Walt repeated the gesture every day. He wrote down names, times, handed out cards. He also changed the way he greeted people. Where there had once been a shoulder pat, he moved to a short nod and a neutral question. "How's it going?" Without nicknames and without words that in 1968 could sound like possession or provocation, depending on who heard them. Some found it strange and left it hanging in the air as criticism. Others were grateful without saying so, as if accepting relief without wanting to draw attention to it. The barbershop went on with its common sounds: scissors, clippers, water dripping at the fountain, the snap of the strop when he ran the razor. But the new written orders settled in like fine dust, entering routines without needing an announcement. On Friday, September 20th, 1968, a dry breeze came in from the east late in the afternoon, carrying dust. The door was open, and the sound of the street came in mixed with the smell of hair oil and the heat still rising from the concrete. On the wall, a calendar with a mountain landscape marked the month with a circle around the 25th. Rent due. Always. As if the paper reminded him the business depended on fixed dates. At 4:23, Cal Henderson came in, a construction worker, one of the oldest regulars. Big hands, a broken nail, a face marked by sun and cement. He saw the notebook, the cards, and spoke loudly so everyone could hear that it was office stuff, that it had always been first come, first served in respect. Walt was sharpening the razor on the leather, a dry, rhythmic sound, and he let the rhythm finish before answering. He did not lift his head right away. He said first come, first served was exactly what it was, only now it was written down. Cal let out a humorless laugh and said the greeting now was just a nod, as if Walt were afraid to touch people. The word afraid fell into the room with a weight that was not only personal. It was the neighborhood's fear since children began crossing invisible borders to go to school and men began meeting in places where they had not met before. Walt put the razor away, wiped his hands on a cloth, and looked at Cal calmly, saying it was not fear, it was care, and care was also a form of respect. Silence formed as if someone had closed a window. Eddie Jackson waited with the card in his hand. Virgil had the newspaper on his lap, but he was not reading. Marcus Lee had come back that day with his father to try to fit in a cut they had not had time for before, and he sat quietly, legs swinging. The door creaked again. A teenager of 15 or 16 came in, light-skinned, brown hair too long for the taste of the older men in the neighborhood, a backpack hanging from one shoulder. On his neck, a purple mark, as if he had been grabbed or hit. He looked at the full room, hesitated, and came in anyway, like someone deciding to pass through a narrow place. Walt kept his tone and asked if he had time. The boy answered softly, saying he was Tommy Laird, and he needed a cut for school because they were riding him. Walt wrote it down, handed him the card. Tommy sat near the door, like someone who wants to get out fast, if anything changes. Outside on the sidewalk, a group of boys in uniform passed by. Some were from Dorsey High, others from different schools. Laughter, shoves, books thumping. One of them, seeing Tommy near the door, pointed and said something that could not be heard, but the tone was mocking and mockery. That year was a spark. Tommy hunched his shoulders. Cal stood up, as if the street had called him. Virgil shifted in his seat. The room took on the energy of something about to break, that electricity that passes from one person to another without anyone admitting it. Walt placed himself between the door and the benches, not as a hero, but as someone who knew where his body needed to be to prevent a collision. He said, looking at the men, not at the boys outside, that not in here, that in here everyone waited their turn. Cal looked at Walt with contained anger and asked if, out there, if they came after them, was Walt going to write it down in the notebook too? Walt answered firmly, without insult, that he was going to close the door, he was going to cut the hair of whoever was on the list, and he was going to go home in one piece. The phrase "go home in one piece" hung in the air. It was not a figure of speech. In 1968, in Los Angeles, going home in one piece had become a daily goal. The following Monday, September 23rd, the news ran the way news runs that no one wants to tell. A school bus stoned in another part of the city, not very far, and a child hurt. It was not someone from Wall Street, but it was close enough to become a subject in every line and to make adults calculate distances in minutes, not miles. In the barbershop, the radio said little, but people talked over the radio as if they needed to fill the silence with warning. Walt continued with the notebook, with a neutral greeting, and added a schedule board on the wall, written in chalk, with 15-minute spaces like a clinic's appointment book, but without pretension. It was not to look modern. It was to take away from improvisation the chance of humiliation. If someone arrived and got jumped in line, a fight could be born right there, in the detail. Walt was cutting off fights in the detail before they took on a body. On Wednesday, October 2nd, 1968, the sky dawned overcast, rare enough to change the street's mood. The air was colder, and people came in turning up their collars. Walt had opened at 7:26, and the notebook already had 5 names when, at 9:10, a tall man came in, worn suit, leather briefcase, the manner of a school employee or someone from the district office. He looked at the chalkboard, looked at the notebook, and asked if he was Walter Dimas. Walt nodded. The man introduced himself as Los Angeles City Schools, Community Support Division, and explained they were asking for neutral spaces for quick meetings with parents, places where people would feel safe. Walt did not like the word safe in the mouth of someone from outside. Safety, to him, was locking the door at home and knowing the neighbor's name. Even so, he understood the request, a place where parents of children from different schools could sit and talk without the street deciding for them. Walt answered that this was a barbershop. The man said that was exactly why, because it was already a place where men sat and waited, and where simple rules could matter more than speeches. Walt looked at the chairs, the floor he swept himself, the open notebook with names lined up like small promises. He did not want to become a meeting stage. He also knew that if it was not there, then where a church hall in another neighborhood, a school room with people coming and going under the eye of authority, a place where every sentence arrived already armed. The barbershop had the advantage of being known and having simple rules, and simple rules, in that moment, were a form of protection. Walt did not answer right away. He only said he would think about it. The man left a card with an address on Beaudry Avenue, downtown, and went out, leaving behind the feeling that the whole city was looking for points of support, as if the ground had become unstable. For Walt, the moral of it was not ideological. It was practical, almost domestic. If the barbershop became a place where people could see one another without attacking, maybe the boys on the street would have less fuel. But if it went wrong, if a fight broke out inside, he would lose what he had built over more than 20 years of rent paid and trust earned, month after month, with the same regularity as the calendar on the wall. On Friday, October 11th, 1968, Walt made the decision. He did not announce it with a banner or call a newspaper. He simply wrote on the chalkboard, below the time slots, that on Tuesdays from 18 to 18:30, there would be a parents' talk, 2 chairs, no arguing at the door. He left 2 chairs in the corner, near the water fountain, free at that hour. It was a small gesture, an invitation without ceremony, but with a clear rule. Inside, what counted was what had been agreed. On the first Tuesday, October 15th, 4 people showed up. 2 fathers and 2 mothers. One was Marcus Lee's father, a thin man, simple white shirt, shift work, few words, the look of someone who measures time because time decides wages. Another was a woman with short hair, nails painted red, a daughter in a school on the other side of the new boundary. She seemed tired of fighting in meetings and only wanted to know how to get the child there and back without being beaten. Walt kept the barbershop open, but he did not cut hair during that interval. He stayed behind the counter, cleaning combs with alcohol, listening without taking part, like someone ensuring the space exists without claiming it. The agreement was simple. Talk about routes, schedules, who could walk with whom to the bus stop, how to warn if there was trouble. No slogans, no broad accusations. Just routine. Just what a person could do the next morning when the alarm rang and the street was there again. It worked for 2 weeks. The barbershop, in that half hour, held a different kind of silence, as if the place were holding its breath so as not to provoke anyone. Some men complained, said Walt was putting on airs. Others respected it, especially those with children who understood fear had no color. It had an address and a time, and it also had the interval between school and the front door. Walt did not try to convince anyone. He only kept the rule the way he kept the blade sharp, with repetition and care, without spectacle, because spectacle was exactly what could set fire to what he was trying to keep standing. At the end of October, on the 29th, a Tuesday, the Santa Ana wind started early, pushing dry leaves along the sidewalk and leaving the air with a metallic taste, a dry throat and stinging eyes. The barbershop was full late in the afternoon because the wind made people want to get things done quickly and go back inside, closing windows and doors. Walt had scheduled the talk for 6. At 5:55, Marcus Lee ran in, without his mother, face flushed. He stopped in the doorway and looked at Walt with wide eyes, saying there were people outside, his voice breaking as if he were swallowing dust. Walt did not ask who. The noise on the street had already changed. It was not the normal sound of traffic and footsteps. It was the murmur of a group, the energy of boys gathering for something that is not play, and that energy arrived before any explanation. Walt went to the door and looked. On the corner, near a newsstand, there were 8 or 10 teenagers. Among them, Tommy Laird was surrounded. He held his backpack with both arms, trying not to fall. One shoved, another laughed, another pointed. It was the kind of scene that happened too fast to become news and too slowly not to leave a mark. Walt's body acted before his mind finished thinking. He was not a man who ran, but he crossed the sidewalk with firm steps, the way he crossed the shop to grab a towel. Behind him, Cal Henderson stood and went with him. Virgil, too. Eddie Jackson stayed still for half a second and followed, as if the body decided on its own that standing still was worse. Walt got close to the group and raised his hand, palm down, a gesture to lower the volume, saying that was enough. The boys looked. Some recognized Walt. Others did not. One of them laughed, calling Walt an old man, as if that settled the scene. Walt did not answer the insult. He looked at Tommy and saw fear and shame mixed together, the mix that makes a boy try to prove something with his hands. Walt told Tommy to go inside, without pleas and without threat, only direction like someone pointing out the exit from danger. Tommy hesitated. In that second, a shove came from the side. Tommy lost his balance and fell against the curb edge, his head hitting the low signpost. The sound was dry, wrong. The group took a step back as if the ground had bitten, and for an instant no one knew what to do with what had happened. Tommy lay on the ground, blinking, a hand going to the side of his head. A thread of blood appeared in his hair. The irreversible happened there, not as a newspaper tragedy, but as an injury that changes a place's memory. The street, already tense, gained concrete proof that tension hurt. Walt crouched carefully, not touching it first, like someone who knows the wrong touch makes it worse. Eddie took off his cap and put it under the boy's head. Virgil, still holding the newspaper, looked around for something to keep the other boys back. Cal stood, shoulders wide, and his sheer size made 2 boys retreat, not from heroism, but from instinct. Walt spoke firmly to Marcus, who had followed to the doorway and was now trembling, telling him to call an ambulance inside now. Marcus ran back. Inside, someone grabbed the black rotary phone and dialed with nervous fingers, waiting for the dial to return each time, as if the mechanism's time was too much time. The radio continued, indifferent, calling an old baseball play, and that made the scene more real, not less, because the world did not stop to match the urgency on a sidewalk. The boys began to scatter, first slowly, then quickly, as if the Santa Ana had blown shame and fear at the same time. One still tried to justify it, but the word died when he heard the siren in the distance, and the siren, even far away, already changed everyone's behavior. The ambulance arrived in less than 10 minutes, but to Walt it felt like an hour. The paramedics asked short questions, put on gauze, secured Tommy's head carefully, and the smell of medical supplies mixed with the hot, dry street. Walt answered what he knew: name, time, fall, impact. He invented nothing. He exaggerated nothing. It was the same honesty with which he wrote times in the notebook. When the ambulance took Tommy away, the street was left with a strange emptiness, as if it had been swept out from the inside. The barbershop, for a few minutes, had no customers. Some left without getting a haircut. Others stayed seated, looking at the floor, as if the floor had shifted and no one wanted to be the first to say so. That night, Walt closed early. He locked the door at 6:42 before the parents' talk. The chalkboard still had the phrase written, but no one showed up. Walt wiped it away with his hand, and the white dust stayed on his fingers, a reminder that even what is simple can disappear from one day to the next. The next day, October 30th, Walt went to the shop on Vernon, where Eddie worked, and asked if anyone knew the boy's condition. He learned Tommy had gotten stitches and would stay home for days, maybe weeks, with a mild concussion. It was not a headline tragedy, but it was an interruption in a teenager's life and in the routine of a family that likely already had fragile routines. In the barbershop, in the days that followed, the list continued. The black notebook grew fuller. The change Walt had made to prevent disputes now had another function: to keep the place predictable when the outside proved it could slip out of control without warning. In November, late afternoon light began to fall earlier. The wind eased, and a mild cold came that made people look for jackets in the closet and close their collars as they came in. Walt kept the notebook, kept the cards, and made one more small, silent change. He replaced the doorbell, which made a sharp tinkle, with a lower bell, less shrill. It was not fussiness. It was so that someone's entrance would not sound like an alarm, so that the bodies of those present would not react as if they were being invaded. The parents' talk returned, but in another format. Instead of two loose chairs in the corner, Walt began leaving a small formica table, an empty ashtray, and a cup of pencils. He taped up a sheet of paper, routes and schedules, sign, and phone. People wrote down numbers, addresses, meeting points. The paper filled with different handwritings and became a kind of human map, made of lines that were not on the district's maps, but that decided whether someone got home. Cal Henderson, who had complained at first, began to show up not to talk, but to be nearby. He sat on the bench, arms crossed, watching the door. He was not a guard. He was presence, and presence, in that moment, was a way to reduce risk without saying a word. Virgil, who liked to talk, learned to talk less during that half hour, as if he understood too many words could become a spark. Eddie began bringing coffee in a better thermos and left paper cups beside it, without saying whose it was, as if the gesture were enough. The barbershop remained a barbershop, clippers vibrating, towels folded, hair on the floor, change counted out, coins and small bills passed hand to hand. But there was also that small interval when speech had to fit inside a simple rule, as if the place were teaching a way to get through the week without getting lost in it. On Saturday, November 9th, 1968, it rained early in the morning, a fine rain that brought the rare smell of wet earth to the city and darkened the asphalt for a few hours. The barbershop was emptier, and Walt could work without hurry, as if time had loosened a little. A man came in with a small boy, and Walt wrote down the name as he wrote down everyone's, without exception, without shortcut. As he cut the boy's hair, he noticed how the scissors, when used calmly, made a sound that was almost soothing. The world outside was redrawing maps, but inside the sound was metal and falling hair, a possible order, a sequence that needed no explanation. At the end of November, Walt received a letter from the county hospital because someone had written the Barbershop's address as a contact on the day of the ambulance. It was a short note informing him that Tommy Laird had been evaluated and needed to avoid intense activity for a while. It asked for no money, asked for nothing, only informed in the dry language of a form. Walt kept the letter in the drawer where he kept bills and receipts, along with the lease contract and an old photograph from when the barbershop had only one chair and the neighborhood seemed smaller. At the start of December, Christmas lights appeared in some windows, timidly. The year ended without a sense of ending, more with a sense of continuous adaptation. Walt began closing the barbershop 15 minutes earlier on Tuesdays, so the parents' talk would end in daylight, and that reduced the anxiety of those who had to walk to the bus stop. There was no speech, only a change on the chalkboard, like so many other changes he made without asking for applause. On December 17, 1968, a Tuesday, the sky was clear and cold. The barbershop smelled of pine because of a new disinfectant Eddie had brought. At 5:40, Tommy Laird appeared in the doorway. He was thinner, his hair grown out, and there was a small scar near the hairline, hidden among strands. He stood still for a second, like someone who does not know if he is allowed to come in, like someone weighing the place's weight after what happened. Walt looked up and, without hurry, opened the black notebook and asked for name and time with the same neutrality as always. Tommy seemed relieved to be treated like anyone else, as if the rule protected him. He stepped forward, said his name, received the card. He sat on the bench near the door, the same as before, but now with his body less hunched. Marcus Lee was in the corner with his father, writing down a bus route for the last day before vacation. And he looked at Tommy for an instant before returning to his writing, as if one person's existence did not threaten the others, as if the space could hold both without demanding confrontation. Walt cut Tommy's hair that afternoon. He did not talk about the accident. He did not ask about the old purple mark. He simply put on the cape, adjusted the towel at the neck, and worked with extra care around the scar, like someone who understands a detail can hurt more than it seems. The sound of the clippers vibrating was steady, and the fall of hair onto the white cloth seemed simple, almost domestic, but it carried the idea that routine was still possible. When he finished, he brushed the boy's neck with a soft brush and applied a little lotion, not too much. Tommy stood, looked at his reflection, and nodded like someone recognizing his own face again. He left coins on the counter and went out without hurry, the backpack now on both shoulders, as if his body had relearned a way to pass through the door. After the door closed and the low bell sounded, the barbershop continued with its small sounds. Paper being folded, pencil scratching, someone coughing, water dripping at the fountain. Los Angeles in 1968 went on outside with news and maps, with school buses crossing lines that had once been rigid, but there, in that narrow space on Crenshaw Boulevard, there was a rule that did not depend on police or on speeches. It depended on a notebook, a pen, and a greeting that did not require intimacy to offer respect, and that in that year was more than style. It was a way to keep the place livable. On Christmas Eve, Walt closed at 4 in the afternoon. He swept the floors slowly, gathering hair of different colors into the same pile, as always happened, and as now seemed more evident, almost didactic. He erased the chalkboard, put the notebook away in the drawer, locked the door, and pulled down the gate. The low sun reflected in the glass, and for an instant the window showed the street and also the empty interior, the chairs lined up waiting for the next business day of the new year. Walt walked to his car, feeling the cold air on his face, carrying with him the practical certainty that certain changes did not need an announcement to become permanent. It was enough to repeat them until they became routine, and routine, even in extraordinary times, was still the most reliable way to keep ordinary people in one piece. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking the video. It helps ensure that these quiet, often forgotten stories continue to be shared. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We also invite you to leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Our viewers come from many places and generations, connected by a shared respect for history and the lives that lived it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.